Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching the Today I Found Our YouTube channel, and in the video today we're looking at the truth about medieval chastity belts. The lasting images of what most of us perceive to be the medieval times include heroic knights, stampeding horses, court gestures, giant turkey legs, ruling kings, and pure maidens wearing chastity belts. But the fact is that besides the more obvious of those that aren't accurate, most scholars believe that the chastity belt didn't actually exist during medieval times, but rather is a product of 18th and 19th century obsession with masturbation as a societal ill and safeguarding women in the workplace. According to the popular myth, chastity belts were locked metal or leather belts that young maidens wore to keep themselves pure. The myths usually date the belts to the Crusades, an approximately 200-year period between the 11th and the 13th centuries, when knights would be gone for years, killing, raping, and pillaging in the name of God, and their wives would be left at home perhaps lonely and looking for companionship, or at least vulnerable to unscrupulous men. So to guard against this, the story goes that the knights would make their wives wear chastity belts as a pledge of fidelity and for protection. Except these stories weren't true, and in fact knights and maidens had likely never even heard the term chastity belt. The adjective chaste first appeared around the 12th century, with the original meaning of virtuous, pure from unlawful sexual intercourse, unlawful intercourse as defined by the church. The first time chaste appeared as a noun was in the 14th century with the definition of a virgin person. The first known depiction of a chastity belt or female chastity device only dates back 600 years to Conrad Kaiser's 1405 book on military technology, Bella Fortis. In the book, Kaiser writes about and draws battering rams, crossbows, instruments of torture, mentions how to castrate a man, and, though not particularly related to war directly, merely soldiers' pastimes, describes a female chastity device. The female chastity device, drawn by Kaiser, is accompanied by the text, translated, "These are hard iron breeches of Florentine women which are closed at the front." He goes on to state in an equally ironic tone, "Padlocks onto the four-legged creatures, breeches onto the women of Florence, a joke binds this lovely series together. I recommend them to the noble and obedient youth." Given the lack of any verifiable artifacts from this era, or indeed a couple of centuries more, and the tongue-in-cheek manner such devices are mentioned here, it is thought by most historians they weren't either widely used, or he simply made them up and was insinuating that Florentine women were not generally open to soldiers' advances. That said, several poems of this era do refer to chastity belts, though as simple strips of cloth that covered the female privates. They are also generally mentioned as more of a symbolic gesture. Essentially, it was a promise ring, but a bit further south. Paintings and drawings from the 15th and 16th centuries depict women wearing metal chastity belts, even padlocks on their tongues, but these appear in stories as fictional narrative elements. As in a story where a jealous husband forces his wife to wear a lock and key belt to prevent her from running off with a rival of his. Certainly, no one would have worn a padlock on their tongue, and wearing such metal devices directly against the skin and genitals for lengthy periods of time was a surefire way to get abrasive wounds and infection, which particularly back then could be lethal. The lack of surviving artifacts or direct documentation of anyone actually wearing these, once again, has historians skeptical that anyone did at this point in history, but at the least with the increasing numbers of mentions in fiction, it is possible that some individuals really did wear them. So when did the first verifiable chastity belt come about? You might have heard that the first was from 1388, owned by Francesco de Carrara II, the last sovereign lord of Padua, the oldest city in northern Italy. The belt was supposedly designed by him, presumably for his wife. The belt is still on display at the Doge's Palace in Venice, but many historians doubt its legitimacy. In fact, several prominent museums, including the world-renowned British Museum, have either removed or changed the dates listed on their collection of similar chastity belts due to concerns that they weren't from the 14th, 15th, or 16th centuries. For instance, one of the chastity belts housed in the Musée de Cluny, National Museum of the Middle Ages in Paris, long thought to belong to Catherine de' Medici, was erroneously labelled as from from the 15th century. In the 1990s, they tested the metal, and as it turns out, it dates only back to the early 19th century. This perhaps shouldn't be a surprise, as the Victorian era was when chastity belts had their heyday. To get around the metal-on-skin problem, these chastity belts typically included some sort of padding, like leather or cloth, which was changed frequently. These belts were typically used for two reasons: to prevent masturbation and to protect women in the workplace. For much of the 19th and even into the 20th century, masturbation by both men and women was considered a societal ill. An 1853 book entitled The Silent Friend gives the example of LD and what happened to him due to his constant masturbation. He less resembled a living creature than a corpse, lying upon straw, meagre, pale, and filthy, casting forth an infectious stench, almost incapable of motion, a watery, palish blood issuing from the nose, the tongue frightfully swelling, and saliva constantly frothing from his mouth. The disorder of the mind was equal to the body. A few decades later in a medical text, it was said you should teach your boy that when he handles or excites the sexual organs, all parts of the body suffer. This is why it is called self-abuse. The sin is terrible and is, in fact, worse than lying or stealing. For although these are wicked and will ruin the soul, self-abuse will ruin both the soul and body. This loathsome habit lays the foundation for consumption, paralysis, and heart disease. It makes many boys lose their minds. Others, when grown, commit suicide. A few centuries earlier, one of the many problems Martin Luther had with the Catholic Church was the idea that the clergy should be celibate, which he felt encouraged the sinful act of masturbation. As he stated, nature never lets up. We are all driven to the secret sin. To say it crudely but honestly, if it doesn't go into a woman, it goes into your shirt. Fast forward back to the 19th century, and according to the Cultural Encyclopedia of the Body, in some circles, girls were not allowed to even ride bikes or horses for fear that this stimulated masturbation. Special boys' pants were designed to prevent them from touching their genitals through the pockets. To that extreme end, chastity belts were forced upon some young women during the Victorian era to prevent masturbation. Also, during this time, some women found wearing chastity belts quite handy outside of any temptation. With the industrial age commencing in America and Europe, more women found themselves in factories and the workplace. At times, these were dangerous places for women, particularly with the rampant drunkenness often found by workers in the factories of this era. Locked metal chastity belts worn away from the home provided a great deal of protection from rape. Today, chastity belts have made a resurgence for use in sexual role-playing. We will leave it at that, but next time someone talks about a fair maiden from medieval times and her chastity belt, you can let them know that the evidence that chastity belts were used during the medieval times is scant, being more a product of the much more recent Victorian era. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a like below. It really helps, and do subscribe if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet. Also, over there on the right are a couple of other videos you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one, and thank you very much for watching.